The play on the field, the court, and the ice is just one part of sports. Behind every game are the people hard at work so we can enjoy the action. They're the owners, administrators, agents, broadcasters, and vendors who bring the games to life. Meet them when you go Behind the Game with Patrick Klinger and Dave Boden.
Welcome to Behind the Game, presented by Blaze Credit Union. I'm Patrick Klinger, president of Agile Marketing Partners. Alongside me, my co-host, he's known as the Wolf of Westminster Street, Dave Boden. And Dave, we're going to talk about one of your absolute favorite topics today, University of Minnesota Athletics.
That is correct, Patrick. Thank you for having me. As a Badger, I can't wait. So let's get right into it. Would definitely like to welcome our guest, Steve Hunegs, Executive Director, Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Steve is also a passionate fan and historian of Gopher athletics, University of Minnesota sports. So welcome, Steve. And before we talk sports, you know, there are times where real life and sports intersect, and there's times where sometimes real life needs some time. And before we start that, Steve is the leader of the JCRC. The day since October 7th, 2023, when Hamas terrorists killed more than 1,000 people in Israel, must be especially difficult for you, your colleagues, as well as Jews around the world. But how has it been for you?
Thank you. First, I want to say thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Dave, for having me on the show. You should know, Dave, that I've campaigned shamelessly with Patrick for an opportunity to come on the show over the years. It was easy. Very sweet. And we're roomies like Oliva and Carew, spending time together with serving our troops and going to Kuwait on behalf of our Minnesota National Guard.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Great pleasure, Patrick and Dave. We'll have detente because you now know I went to Wisconsin, too.
Yes, that's right. We have a lot in common. We lived in the same dorm.
There you have it. Turning to the serious issue, and I appreciate the question. Governor Walz, yesterday I attended the deployment ceremony for the 34th, the company headquarters, the divisional headquarters for the 34th. And the governor noted in his talk that our men and women are going through a very dangerous time to go to the Middle East. And he said, you know, after Hamas's attack on Israel, I mean, he sort of emphasized that. The point there, this is all very local. You know, when we have members of our National Guard who are going into the Middle East, where you have Iran, where you have Hamas, where you have the terrorism, where you have Hezbollah, we really have to think about the welfare of our soldiers and our airmen who are going. And that brings me to this point. Hamas attacks Israel, as you correctly note, on October 7. But in a way, that was Iran attacking Israel. That was Hezbollah attacking Israel. They're all a part of this nexus, this axis of terrorism. Not only war directed against Israel, but against the United States too, and against all democracies. And that's how I see it. That's how our organization sees it. And in some ways, Israel is on the front lines, really the initial opponent in a way of Iran, but there are our soldiers and our airmen. And so in that way, we're united too, right, at this time.
Steve, I understand you've invited groups of journalists, law enforcement, community members into your home.
True enough.
To watch footage of the attack so they could fully understand the horror of what happened that day.
It was not something I did with any relish, to say the least. In fact, when I would call and invite people, I would say, I hope you don't come, right? But on the other hand, it's important to bear witness. I would tell people, as I understood it, because I had not yet seen the video, that it could leave with you with nightmares, a searing experience, something you'll remember for the rest of your lives. And you know, talking to the people who were there, it's probably true. The point there was people have to see, sort of develop a tactile, visceral sense of what the attack was all about. And you remember, Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of Israel. This was completely consistent, if you wanted to speak of it in a cold way, of their goals, and that is to launch murderous attacks. You know, their leader has said, October 7, we want to achieve it again and again and again. You have to take these people, these terrorists, at their word. You know, again, Hamas may initially target Israel, but it's a war against the United States ultimately. And you know, that's one reason the people that we invited were people that are important with respect to our national defense. Give them the opportunity to see with their own eyes.
You know, it's unfortunate that we have, I think, in society, including here in the United States, at times this undercurrent of anti-Semitism and other just intolerance of groups, and they're come to the surface even more when there are world events like this. All of us know the story of Jackie Robinson and the abuse he endured while breaking the color line in Major League Baseball. But Jews have also long endured stereotypes in sports. Even recently, athletes like Kyrie Irving, NBA's Kyrie Irving, have posted anti-Semitic posts, and again, sometimes you see more of this type of thing bubble to the surface at times. What, if anything, can sports teach us about anti-Semitism, and how can it help us in sports or otherwise overcome that?
Thankful, first of all, I think all the major sports leagues, all the major leagues responded to October 7th, right, which was important. As you correctly point out, a career for Patrick and something in which you're interested. Professional sports play a huge role in our lives, and to sort of hear the solidarity expressed by all the leagues is critically important for everybody in this country. The Wilf family, the Wilfs are very strong supporters of the JCRC, and Mark, of course, is a global leader in the Jewish community, and so we thank Mark for his leadership. So that's an important sports piece of it too. But I'll say that sports have always been, as you know well, Jackie Robinson's story, the backdrop against which many of our national dramas are played out. Go back to Hank Greenberg in 1935, the Tigers are in the pennant race, and he chose to play on Rosh Hashanah. He wasn't really sure what to do, and he hit an important home run in the Tigers' pennant drive, but he did not play on Yom Kippur that year. And Detroit writer, I'm forgetting his name, wrote a very famous poem about his fact that he decided to sit out on Yom Kippur. Remember Detroit, 1930s, Father Coughlin, the radio preacher, right, full of invective and hate towards Jews, helped bring the community together at that time. Koufax, 65, right here, World Series, doesn't pitch game one because it's Yom Kippur. Little known, Bob Stein the next year, Gopher great for future Kansas City and Viking and New Orleans Saints, he did not play. And think about that. That was one of 10 games. Gophers played 10 games in 1966, and he chose to sit out the game that was scheduled on Yom Kippur. People had an opportunity to see Jewish commitment to their traditions, to their faith, and it did a lot to address anti-Semitism. I think Sandy Koufax was seen as someone who stood up for what was right by not playing on Yom Kippur. So as much as there's been anti-Semitism in sports, there's also been an opportunity for the Jewish community to express itself or its highest aspirations through sports, whether high school, college, or professional.
Stephen, in 1972, terrorists killed 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. You know, in this time of heightened tension, is it dangerous for Jewish athletes? Particularly if they're traveling abroad?
Great question, right? It's interesting you talk about 72. Jay Robinson, just to bring it home locally, was on the Olympic team in 72 for the United States. And I've talked to him before, and he's told me a little bit about what that was like, because they were very close to the scene where the terrorists had kidnapped these Israeli hostages too. I've not heard that so much expressed. I'll say JCRC, one of our many missions is community security. Just to bring the folks at home a little bit of background, we have two community security professionals that assist our community. In fact, we reach out to many other communities and assist them with their community security, trying to take something that is difficult and provide assistance to other communities, which is really important to us. We always say that whether you're traveling in the world, whether you're going to synagogue, whether you're going to school, whether you're visiting at the JCRC office, we still want to remain warm and welcoming. We don't want to discourage anyone from going to synagogue. We don't want to discourage anybody from traveling abroad. Sadly, terrorism is something of a fact of life. We know that in our country from September 11th. But we don't want to grant any victories to terrorists. And so we secure ourselves, prepare ourselves. The whole world changed for the American Jewish community in October 2018 when the Pittsburgh synagogue was attacked, and you had one of the most murderous days towards Jews in the United States history. But we learn from these events. We learn how to protect ourselves. We learn how to protect our entire community. So I'm hoping that no Jewish athlete in the world is discouraged from participating in whatever sport because of terrorism, right? I will say it for Israel. Israel has been forced to play some soccer matches in empty stadiums because of the horrendous amount of anti-Semitism in Europe. So that may be someone, as I'm thinking here about your question, Patrick, to your point, how it has changed, how October 7 has changed some play, at least in terms of Israel and the international competition.
Well, sports certainly mirrors society, but as a few of the examples you mentioned, sometimes can be that proving ground about how things can work.
Sure.
More so, and we hope, we can hope that continues to be the case. But kind of speaking of sports, we'll shift gears just a little bit. So you've spoken very eloquently about the history of the University of Minnesota athletics, especially when the Gophers dominated college football between 1933 and 41.
Dave can barely utter those words, but I'm proud of you.
Yeah. What made those teams so special, though, or what did make them so special, and what did they mean to the state of Minnesota coming through the Great Depression and the war years? Tell us a little bit about the early years.
And by the way, you listened to those games back then, didn't you?
Yeah.
Well, my dad did.
My dad and I would sit around the radio and get those
on your Philco.
tuned in, exactly.
First a word of background. Why am I so passionate about Minnesota sports? Well, I grew up with it. My maternal grandfather, who was born in Idaho, came back when he got married to my grandma. He actually had gone to UCLA and then the University of Utah, and then came to live here when he met my grandma. And his brothers-in-law, my grandma's brothers, were all fanatic Gopher football fans in the 30s. So that was one stream. My dad grew up on the north side of Minneapolis in the traditional Jewish community, didn't have very much money, could really not afford to go to the games. He went to one game in 1940, went to one game in 1941. He's still hale and hearty at 92, believe me. But he would sit and listen on the radio. And so he grew up a fan, even though he rarely got a chance to go. So I get it from both sides, my mom's side and through my dad. Went to my first Gopher hockey, basketball, and football games in 1970, right as a 7-year-old, or as a first grader, and I was hooked, as a matter of fact. So you get this memorabilia collection. But going back to the Gophers, one thing, shameless plug for Danny Spiewak's book. If you want to read about the 1941 book and some of the topics that Dave was talking about, the coming of the war, how it impacted the 1941 Gopher football season and vice versa, it's a fascinating read. You can read all about so many of the issues. This was the time. Football, again, was a backdrop against what was particularly happening in Europe. In this country, the struggle between isolationism and interventionism, right? Charles Lindbergh is sort of the notorious, besides being the great aviator, had a dark side to him, and that was his role as the leader of America First. Nothing per se wrong with that. Might have had a difference of opinion with him, but he descended into anti-Semitism when he talked about the issues involving Germany and the United States in World War II. In fact, a date we'll all remember, September 11, 1941, he made probably the most anti-Semitic address by a prominent American ever made on national radio. So something to sort of Google there. But yes, 30s were full of depression. The Gophers gave people in Minnesota hope. Minnesota is a relatively poor state in the 1930s. We think of Minnesota in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s with national figures and Fortune 500 companies, but we are an agricultural state. Agriculture was in a state of depression in the 1930s, going back into the 1920s. Didn't have a lot of money in Minnesota, and the Gophers were the epitome of college football for all those years and dominated all of their rivals and the like. And Bernie Bierman was a household name. You speak of Jews, and we were talking about Jews in sports. Of course, the 41 team had Butch Levy, who was a lineman for the team. He was the NCAA heavyweight wrestling champion in 1941. Went off and joined the Navy. Actually married a woman whose family had fled Nazi Germany. Lucky Belson was her name. So reading the book or talking about Gopher football, sort of all the strands of the 1930s come together.
Bernie Bierman was the legendary coach
Yeah.
of those Gopher teams in the 30s and early 40s. What was his relationship like, Steve, with Jews and African-American players of that time?
I don't think there were any issues with Jews, as far as we can tell. Sig Harris was his longtime assistant. Sig Harris played for the Gophers in the early part of 1905, 1906, when the Gophers were an early powerhouse under Dr. Williams. Okay, and then Butch Levy, other Jewish players on the 40-41 teams, and Neil Littman from St. Paul and the like. much different relationship with African Americans, right? I'm not saying necessarily Bernie Bierman was a racist himself, but he certainly was consistent with the tenor of the times. When Minnesota played Tulane in Texas, and I'm forgetting the years, 36, 37, 35, 36, Horace Bell and Dwight Reed were African American players on the team that were held out of those games. There was a gentleman's agreement in those days that if a northern team played a southern team, the black players wouldn't play. And so it was covered somewhat in the press of the time. There was a good article in the Minnesota Alumni Magazine, it must have been about September 2020, about one of the anniversaries of it. Well, I think it was because of the 50th anniversary, 60th anniversary of the Gophers national championship team in 1960, and talked about Sandy Stevens as the first All-America black quarterback for the Gophers, and they went back into some of the Gophers' less favorable history with respect to race relations, too. And so that's always been something of a stain on the history of Gopher football. As we were talking about, though, it's a completely mixed bag. Where Murray Warmath comes in and actively recruits African-American football players, because a lot of the southern schools, most of the southern schools were not recruiting African-Americans at that time. Bobby Bell, Carl Eller, Sandy Stevens all came. Well, Sandy Stevens came from Pennsylvania, but a lot of the southern players didn't have an opportunity to play football in the South, and they came to Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin too, of course.
So, speaking of Sandy Stevens, the Gophers football dynasty kind of faded a bit after World War II, but saw a good resurgence in the early 60s, due at least in part to recruitment of African-American players from the South, from the East, just like you were talking about. And Sandy Stevens was, in fact, I think that's right, the first All-American African-American player. So with that integration success, how did the white fans, react to this sort of being between the change in society and sports being that leading edge of that?
There's so much to talk about there, right? Civil Rights Act, Kennedy election, 1964 Civil Rights Act, Kennedy assassination, so many pieces that fit in to the story. But 59, when a lot of the great African-American football players were sophomores, this first class with African-American recruits in a significant number, Minnesota finished last in the Big Ten, and garbage was dumped on Murray Warmath's lawn, and someone was hanged in effigy. You know what that means, lynching. Right. You're talking about lynching when you're talking about hanging somebody in effigy. Also, Minnesota had a tradition of sort of generations of players from Minnesota playing together, right? And to some, African-American football players violated any number of traditions and mores in society. But Warmath, interestingly, was from the South. He'd been the head coach at Mississippi State before he came to Minnesota, and he was not deterred in the slightest. And then the next year, almost like a storybook, they go from last place in the Big Ten to national champions, right? Hubert Humphrey was strongly involved. He would more or less sort of informally recruit from Minnesota, because this was aligned with his values, right? 1948 National Democratic Convention, when he rose to prominence, making the famous speech in favor of civil rights. And so this was something that was important to him, and it was reflected in the University of Minnesota football program. Someday we'll talk about what happened in the 1962 game between Wisconsin and Minnesota, right? A very controversial outcome. Right?
It's a good story. I mean, feel free, or
Well,
we
it
can
depends on
take
who won
that
the
up
game.
another time.
Minnesota was winning 9-7. And Bobby Bell, speaking of African-American players in Minnesota, knocked down the quarterback, Ron Vanderkellen. The ball went end over end, and a guy named Mike Perkovich from Duluth intercepted the pass. It looked like Minnesota had cinched the game. They called Bobby Bell for roughing the passer. Okay, in a very controversial call, Wisconsin retains possession, goes in and scores the winning touchdown. The call was so notorious that when they were introducing it halftime of the Army-Navy game, All-America, President Kennedy was on the field shaking all the players who were All-America, and he said, "That was a bad call in the Minnesota-Wisconsin game, wasn't it?" So if President Kennedy said it, Dave, it's got to be true, right?
So the bad calls in the Gopher-Wisconsin game started in 1962.
Well, they're probably no.
Continued year after year.
Year after year, Dave. What can you say, right? We'll see what happens in the hockey series this weekend, right?
Exactly.
Right. I brought some. Do we have time to look at?
Yeah, please.
Oh, we got some
Sure,
time
yeah.
here, but I don't want to preempt your questions.
I wanted to ask you one question
Please.
about Butch Levy,
Yeah.
who's also happened to be the father of a dear, dear longtime friend of mine, Randy Levy.
Randy, right.
Right? So I knew a lot about Butch Levy, and he was a star on the Gopher
No
football
question
team.
about that.
Champion wrestler, NCAA champion wrestler, went on to play professional football. He was a professional wrestler. Incredible career. Did Butch help break down some of the stereotypes that Jews couldn't be great athletes? I mean, here's a guy who was, maybe one of the best, could be the best athlete in the country.
Well, playing at 240 pounds, which was big for that time, right? Probably the case. I don't know if it's ever really addressed in Danny's book, but I'm sure he was very proud of who he was. I knew, Randy, I knew Peter. And Peter played football in Hamlin and went to St. Louis Park like Randy did. So I got a chance to know Peter because he dated and then married the sister of a good friend. So I would see Peter around the house of the good friend. And from time to time we would talk about Butch, but he was very proud of his identity, and there was no mistaking him with the last name Levy, right? In 1940 and 1941, who he was, and of course he went into the service too, like so many of the other players in the 1941 team. So, I would imagine, given the prominence that Minnesota football had around the state and around the region, and someone named Butch Levy, all Big Ten guard, national champion in wrestling, people probably had a lot of respect for him. And if you just to get in the game for Bernie Bierman, right? Guys playing mostly two ways at that time, that was an accomplishment, especially with all the depth Minnesota had.
So, Steve, as we mentioned earlier, and it's clear from conversation, you really are a true historian. You have an amazing collection. Gopher Athletics. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of what you brought today?
Or some would say I need more to do in life. That's a different story.
All this stuff, though, it's not just the collection. Sports is kind of that glue that binds all the generations together.
It is true.
And I think that these things kind of speak to that probably over with you and your family and things over time.
It's well said, Dave. I grew up going to games with my grandpa and my dad and my brother and mom, sister, a lot of family members go for games, so it was a big part of our family. Don't ask the rabbis about Friday night Gopher hockey games, right? Don't want to keep that quiet. But here, speaking of race issues, 1935 Minnesota-Iowa game, and this game was famous, notorious for Floyd of Rosedale, which is famous, but the story behind it is more difficult, and that is Gopher football players in the 34 game were accused of roughing up Ozzie Simmons, who was a great African-American back. Remember, it was double wing offense, so it could have been quarterback, halfback, fullback, whatever it was in the case, but he was one of the most exciting players in the country, and the Gophers were accused of trying to injure him in the game, which was sort of a decisive Minnesota win. There was a lot of pressure and a lot of tension leading up to the 35 game, which was played in Iowa City. And I can't remember if he was the Iowa coach or the Iowa governor, I think it was the Iowa coach, said that if Minnesota resorts to what he called roughing up tactics, no one could be responsible for the conduct of the crowd. Governor Floyd Olson at that time, and then Governor Herring of Iowa decided, well, this is getting a little bit out of control at this point. And so they decided that to cool tempers, the thing to do was, let's have a trophy for the outcome of the game. And they decided it would be a pig. Minnesota, Iowa, both pork-producing states. And they actually picked out a pig coat from Rosedale Farms in Iowa. And Governor Herring, with a twinkle in his eye, said, we'll call it Floyd of Rosedale after Floyd Olson in Minnesota. And that sort of relaxed some of the tension for the game. People had something else to think about. Floyd of Rosedale, Minnesota wins the football game. The next year they come with that beautiful trophy, right? Not a kosher trophy, it's pork, right? But a beautiful trophy. And nonetheless, one of the most iconic football trophies. So this is the story, and this is the program from that game.
Very cool.
1935, I brought this along because Minnesota, when it went to Pitt and beat Jock Sutherland's Pitt Panthers, the great Eastern powerhouse in 1934, it really put Minnesota on the national football map, and Bernie Bierman too. It's a great win, 13-7 at Pittsburgh. Suddenly Minnesota was a contender for the national championship. Again, I deserve really no credit for collecting these items. If you Google things on the internet, it's amazing what you can find, right? It's not like going from garage sale to garage sale to do it. But here, okay, Minnesota, Wisconsin, 1934, just for Dave, right?
Yeah.
This is here for Dave,
Nice.
wanting to make sure. I think the game was played at Camp Randall, right? You can just see, I just sort of love these old programs, how colorful they were. I think this is the 36 Minnesota Iowa game played back in Minneapolis at Memorial Stadium.
Yeah, I don't know if you could see on there, but You've got
sorry.
Floyd or Rosedale right
Yeah.
in that picture there, which
Oh
is
my
kinda
God, you're
cool.
right. I'm going too fast, so
Yeah.
people are missing the texture of what we're
That's right.
discussing here. And then, I know what we have in common. Beating Michigan, it's great, right?
Yeah. Michigan, Ohio
Here,
State,
give me a
whoever you
very
want to
good
take.
fifth
All
one. There you go.
We got a common bond there.
Well, Wisconsin's had a lot of success against Ohio State over the years.
At times.
As an
At
aside.
times.
So this was Minnesota. You can read about it in Danny's book again. This was the de facto national championship game in '41, Minnesota at Michigan. My grandparents actually went to the game. They used to travel back and forth. They had some friends, the Massermans from Detroit. When Michigan came here, the Massermans came here. When Minnesota went to Michigan, the Applebombs went to Michigan. And this is not their, I bought this on the internet. This is not their game ticket, but I decided it would be fun to have a game ticket from the game. But we have pictures of my grandparents at the game, which was a lot of fun. In any event, this is the program. And Minnesota beats Michigan 7-6 to win the national championship, right? And Michigan was incredibly frustrated against Minnesota. Tom Harmon, their great back, or a great quarterback, played Minnesota 3 times, and Minnesota beat him each time, 39, 40, and 41. Of course, the 41 Minnesota team had Bruce Smith. Bruce Smith's father was Lucius Smith, who was a lawyer practicing in Faribault until his 90s. Lucius played for the Gophers in the teens. The story has it they lost a heartbreaking game to Michigan, and Lucius said, "I will have a boy someday who will play for Minnesota who will never lose to Michigan."
Wow.
So that's the story, maybe somewhat apocryphal,
we'll go with it.
but it's a great story, right? And Minnesota wins the national championship effectively at Michigan. Can't get much better than that,
No,
right?
no, that's pretty cool.
And Bruce Smith, as you read Danny's description of the game, set up the winning touchdown first with a huge punt. I mean, he could do it all, Bruce Smith. And then he threw a long pass that set up the Gophers' touchdown. So first he punted the Gophers out of trouble, and then the next possession threw a long pass which set up the winning touchdown against Michigan. So there he was, a three-way player, could do it all. And then here, another Wisconsin program. I just thought this was so much
that's
fun.
cool. It's good.
In the 1940 game too. And then a couple other, here is Gopher basketball program when they went to play the Aloha Classic in Hawaii. My folks went with the team and had it autographed. This is Musselman's first year. They won the Big Ten championship, and lo and behold, Dave Winfield's a member of the team, and he signs it as Dave the Ray Winfield. But now going back, gentlemen, to your issue about the advent, in a way, of African-American football players at Minnesota. This was a book given to me when I was a 3rd or 4th grader by my godmother, Dorothy Samsky, and over the years I had, so this is 72, over the years I had Gopher football players autograph it, but here's a fun page, Sandy Stevens and Bobby Bell.
Yeah.
Sandy Stevens, as you say, the first All-America African-American quarterback, and then Bobby Bell, who was greater than Bobby Bell, all right, college football and pro football Hall of Fame.
It's still around.
Still around and still very active, comes up here often. He has, the story goes, and I've heard it from him, and I don't think I'm telling, personal services contract still to this day with the Hunt brothers. Mm-hmm. Isn't the Hunt brothers?
He's a wonderful ambassador.
Yeah,
Wonderful ambassador for the Chiefs.
And as always, remains thoroughly dedicated to the University of Minnesota, Bobby Bell. So what a great story, huh?
Absolutely. Fascinating, Steve. Fascinating
And then
stuff.
someday, maybe, back to the Rose Bowl.
You know, this conversation could go on for another half an hour. I've got a lot of questions I would have loved to have asked you, but thank you so much
Thank
for being on the
you.
show. Thanks for sharing this incredible collection.
Yeah, it really is. It really is something.
And I saw a little bit of peace between a Badger and a Wisconsin, or a Badger and a
We can
Gopher
make it.
fan
We
today.
can make it work.
It can happen. It
Yeah.
is mostly a friendly rivalry,
Yeah.
which is one of the nice
is.
things about it. It's kind of fun.
So thank you, Dave. Always great to see you. Thank you for being on the show and co-hosting.
Patrick.
Thank you, all of you, for watching. This has been Behind the Game presented by Blaze Credit Union. We'll see you again next month.